resuscitation procedures are performed.
Belgrade police said the teenager waited to be arrested in the schoolyard after calling police himself to confess what he'd done.
Upon arriving at school, he immediately pulled the pistol out of his bag and shot DV, the security guard. He then went past the on-duty staff member and sat down at his desk like he did nothing wrong.
Despite one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world, mass shootings in Serbia are rare. Police said the attack had been carefully plotted for more than a month. While the precise motive is unclear, the education minister and this high school student blamed violent video games and media.
This themization and popularization of violence and crime through public and media, through art, through everything that can popularize it, and this example of violence is a consequence of that.
Police have cordoned off the scene and continue to investigate. And while answers may bring clarity for families, they won't bring back the young lives taken far too soon. Scott McLean, CNN.
The two rival military factions in Sudan are digging in and seem to be dividing up the country between them. Heavy fighting has been reported around the presidential palace, which is controlled by the paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces. Fighting has been reported around other key landmarks as well as infrastructure. The Sudanese armed forces have agreed to South Sudan's proposal for a 7-day ceasefire scheduled to take effect Thursday, but still no official response from the RSF. CNN's David McKenzie following developments from Johannesburg.
Despite ceasefire announcements being made repeatedly, on Wednesday there were still reports from eyewitnesses and CNN reporters on the ground of clashes and airstrikes in Khartoum in Sudan. The UN says that more than 100,000 people have left the country and at least 3 times that many are stuck within the country displaced. The head of the humanitarian response, UN Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths, was in Port Sudan. There's a need for everything, he says, food, water, medical supplies, and the need is very urgent to get to civilians in Sudan. But he said what is critical is that there are assurances of security for both their staff and for those supplies.
We will still require agreements and arrangements to allow for movement of staff and supplies. We will need to have agreement at the highest level and very publicly, and we will need to deliver those commitments into local arrangements that can be depended on.
To illustrate his point, he said 6 trucks of the World Food Programme were looted on their way into Darfur. And in Darfur, there's been some of the most chaotic scenes. Eyewitnesses saying that there have been repeated clashes in cities like El Geneina, where all of the hospitals are closed. They say it means that people are streaming across the border into Chad, where they are getting help from the UNHCR and others. But if there isn't a meaningful ceasefire in the coming days, you can imagine this humanitarian catastrophe will get even worse in Sudan. David McKenzie, CNN, Johannesburg.
Alan Boswell is the Horn of Africa Director for the International Crisis Group. He's with us this hour from Nairobi. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, John.
So right now, both sides seem to be scrambling to take control of key infrastructure and prominent landmarks. So let's listen to the UN Secretary General on the current situation and what he wants.
The present situation is totally unacceptable, that a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire needs to take place, that a political dialogue needs to be established, and that the transition for a civilian government needs to be guaranteed.
So while this fighting is ongoing with looting and bloodshed, it seems unlikely that there's any kind of negotiation for peace anytime soon, because there's still a lot of bloodshed, a lot of fighting to go with these two sides.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of attempts at ceasefires. They continue to agree to ceasefires, but they essentially immediately break down. So we're moving into a situation now where people are starting to consider worse scenarios, such as the fighting continues. Are there ways of creating maybe some de-escalation zones? Are there ways of trying to find some sort of humanitarian corridors? Are there ways of getting representatives to talks even as they keep fighting? But the kind of hope or expectation initially that maybe we could get these two to agree to some sort of a more full ceasefire, those sort of hopes are dimming, unfortunately.
And with that in mind, I want you to listen to a representative of the leader of Sudan's army who is speaking from Egypt. Listen to this.
There's no responsible government or state that would accept mediation with those who rebelled against it and caused all this instability, damage, and fighting. Mediation comes in issues lighter than this, when there's no military conflict.
So, I mean, that statement just seems incredulous when just taken on the surface. But with both sides here well-armed and well-stocked, with ammunition to varying degrees, the RSF has the light weapons, the Sudanese army has the jets and the tanks. But it seems that that statement that this will not be a negotiated end to this conflict is very ominous. It means that essentially this conflict is going to be dragging on for a very prolonged period of time.
Yeah, that's the risk. These are scary remarks coming out. They're not very surprising. The parties, have been fielding phone calls from diplomatic powers urging them to go to talks. But we've especially seen the army very intent, I think, on trying to gain an upper hand so they don't go back to talks with this paramilitary on the same sort of equal footing that they started with. But the problem is this paramilitary force is still swarming the capital with fighters, is more or less entrenched in residential areas, and we're looking at a very prolonged fight. And because this is taking place in the capital, Khartoum, you have essentially a state collapse while this is going on. So it's not looking good if we're not able to somehow get this resolved soon.
Yeah, and one of the main challenges facing the UN and other aid organizations is with security. Trucks carrying humanitarian supplies are being looted despite assurances. Here's a little more from the UN's Martin Griffiths. Listen to this.
It's not as if we're asking for the moon. We're asking for the movement of humanitarian supplies and people. We do this in every other country. Even without ceasefires, it's a tradition of the humanitarian enterprise to go where others don't.
Compared to the Sudanese army, the RSF went into this fight lacking the logistics for medical treatment for their wounded and others. Are they more likely to be behind the hijackings of the humanitarian medical supplies and the commandeering of hospitals?
Well, I think it's hard to say specifically who's behind what without looking into further information. I mean, both sides have forces throughout the country, but there are many other armed groups in Sudan too. And so one of the big risks is that we see these other armed groups, tribal militias, community militias, join this fight, and we see something that looks like localized power struggles, civil wars, or just a really breakdown in security generally. I think a lot of the problems for humanitarian aid might not specifically come from either of these two groups. They might just come from the general lack of security in other armed groups in the country. We're looking at a very scary scenario in Sudan.
Yeah, it's going to go from bad to worse in a blink of an eye. Alan, thank you for being with us. Technical problems and all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Could 10 times be the charm? Another hike in interest rates by the US Fed, but maybe this could be the last for a while. And police raids from Italy to Brazil, targeting one of the richest and notorious organized crime groups in the world. Those details next.
What a night! What an amazing final!
Easy jars?
Actually, gentlemen, we got a special place for that.
Steve, my old plan. Our first stop, Bosphorus. Second stop, Karakoy.
Teşekkürler.
Teşekkürler.
Thank you. Next stop, Galata.
Football is more than a game. Istanbul is more than a final.
once-in-a-lifetime event, the coronation of King Charles III. Celebrate with Anderson Cooper, live from Buckingham Palace. Watch with the world this history is made. Go inside Westminster Abbey and see the largest procession ever.
Thousands will come here to witness the famous balcony appearance of the newly crowned King and Queen.
The coronation of King Charles III. Special coverage Saturday on CNN.
Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro says he has nothing to hide, which worked out well because his home was raided by police investigating falsified COVID vaccine cards. 3 of Bolsonaro's former aides have already been arrested, including a close personal assistant who's accused of being the mastermind of the scheme, which involved the former president shown to be registered as vaccinated, even though he wasn't. Some of Bolsonaro's former advisors, even his 12-year-old daughter, are under scrutiny. Bolsonaro told reporters he was not vaccinated against COVID-19 and that his vaccination card was never tampered with.
My mobile phone has been seized. My phone has no password. I will make that very clear. I have nothing to hide. Not only about the vaccination card. I have nothing to hide about anything. It would be good if we had a democratic country where we could discuss all subjects. There are subjects that are forbidden to talk about in Brazil, and one of them is about the vaccine.
Police say falsifying health records constitutes a number of crimes. Europol says one of the most powerful and feared mafia groups in the world has suffered a major blow after a series of raids by thousands of police officers in multiple countries. Arrests were made across Europe as well as in Brazil and Panama. Barbie Nadeau has more now, reporting in from Rome.
More than 130 people have been arrested in multiple European countries in what authorities are calling the largest ever coordinated hit against Italian organized crime. The arrests were part of the Eureka operation and tied to the increasingly powerful 'Ndrangheta crime syndicate based in the southern Italian region of Calabria that has achieved global reach. 108 of the arrest warrants were handed down in Italy. The rest were made in Belgium, Germany, France, Slovenia, Spain, and Romania. Arrests were also made in Brazil and Panama. More than 2,770 officers were involved. The massive sting operation took nearly 2 years of investigation that unraveled an international network of drug smuggling from South America to Europe and Australia. A number of European seaports were also involved, officials said at a press conference announcing the successful operation. The arrests were tied to the 'Ndrangheta's extensive global drug smuggling network, and charges included arms trafficking, money laundering, mafia association, and aiding and abetting of fugitives. Millions of euro in cash, drugs, and weapons were also confiscated in the raids. Barbie Nadeau, CNN, Rome.
An almost 8-hour-long manhunt has ended with an arrest of the alleged shooter who opened fire at a medical facility in Atlanta, killing 1 woman and wounding 4 others. 24-year-old Dion Patterson was captured at a condominium complex about 16 kilometers from the crime scene. The suspect had gone to the medical facility with his mother. She says he was seeking a new treatment. Police say at some point he became agitated, opened fire with a handgun. The woman who was killed has been identified as a 38-year-old who worked at the U.S. Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention. The 4 wounded women were taken to hospital. 3 remain in critical condition. Well, Americans may be paying a little more as interest rates go up for mortgages, credit cards, and automobile loans. That's after the U.S. Fed hiked its benchmark interest rate by 0.25%, the 10th consecutive raise. Now at 5 to 5.25%, the official rate. But the Fed chairman suggested rate hikes might take a breather for a while to see if inflation eases. The uncertainty, though, rattled Wall Street that had been running higher earlier in the day. All 3 major indices ended down, just less than 1%. And in Asian markets, 2 up, 2 down. The Hang Seng up there by almost 1%. Shanghai Composite up by almost 0.75%. Seoul down a touch. And Australia's ASX 200 down by nothing, pretty much flat. CNN's Matt Egan has more now on the rate hike and what it means.
The Fed's war on inflation goes on, for now at least. This marks the 10th straight meeting with a rate hike, bumping up borrowing costs to levels unseen in more than 15 years. But the Fed did drop hints, significant hints, about a pause in this inflation-fighting campaign. Maybe. This rate hike was a unanimous decision, but it was also a controversial one because it comes just days after the second largest bank failure in American history. And these recent bank failures were caused in part by the Fed's spike in interest rates. By lifting rates even higher this week, some experts warn that the Fed is basically pouring gasoline on the fire, setting the stage for a credit crunch and perhaps a recession. Now, the Fed is signaling that this inflation fight could be nearing an end. Officials removed a key line from the statement that previously indicated more rate hikes are likely coming. Fed Chair Jerome Powell described this as a, quote, meaningful change, and he left the door open for a pause depending upon what happens next in the economy. But Powell also said that no decision was made at this week's meeting to pause at the next meeting in June. So what does all of this mean for consumers? Well, there's just no relief coming yet from crushing borrowing costs. Mortgage rates, they have jumped nearly 3 percentage points since the Fed started raising rates last March. Typical car loan rates, they're at 13-year highs, and it has never been more expensive to carry credit card debt. And even if the Fed does pause rates soon, Powell indicated today that they're in no rush to cut rates yet. The big question is how much this banking crisis is going to slow down lending and hurt the economy. And no one, not even the Fed, knows the answer to that. Back to you.
Matt Egan, thank you. We'll take a short break. When we come back, who is behind the drone attack on the Kremlin? Has an early morning barrage of missile fire on Kyiv been just the beginning of Russian retaliation?
"300 years of history within the walls of this mud brick maze at Tareif in Ad-Diriyah, the birthplace of Saudi Arabia.
I've never been to a place like Diriyah. You feel the history when you walk in.
Preserving the past is an integral part of Saudi Arabia's future, with Diriyah being at the center of the kingdom's multi-billion-dollar development plan to promote its heritage.
They're bringing the culture with them everywhere they go, and that's like the biggest part. You cannot make that up. That's where the authenticity comes from for me. They're always looking for ways to blend in the heritage with the modernity. They're moving with the times, maybe even ahead of the times, but they're keeping their history alive.
Recently acquired Diamond Bank. What are your plans to continue to grow your footprint on the continent and also elsewhere, like, for example, the United States?
I mean, first of all, we want to be seen and known as Africa's gateway to the world, which means that basically 30% of trade at the minimum that happens in the continent is facilitated by access. So in doing all of this, it means that we need to have that network that facilitates intra-African trade. So we're literally building that railroad from Lagos all the way to Johannesburg. If you want to make payments, it will happen instantaneously. Even in the US, you don't have it, all right? So there are different things as far as payments are concerned and financial services are concerned that we're basically building across the continent. So if you look at our 5-year plan, I think we're right on track with the 8 countries that we want to be present in. For the end of the next 5-year corporate strategic plan, we definitely would have put our flags in the US.
This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
Welcome back. I'm John Ball as you're watching CNN Newsroom. Authorities in Ukraine's capital Kyiv report the most intense attack so far this year in the early hours of Thursday morning. But officials say 18 of 24 Russian drones were intercepted by their air defense. The latest wave of airstrikes comes after 2 drones were shot down over the Kremlin in Moscow. More now from Nick Baton-Walsh.
It's on the edges of imagination, but the Kremlin insists it's real. An apparent drone flies into the Kremlin and detonates right on its dome. Captured on many cameras, a truly seismic allegation. Russia saying Ukraine sent 2 drones to kill President Vladimir Putin, but he wasn't home. As the smoke rose, these videos played out globally, unverified and the only slim evidence of the Kremlin's claim. It is a moment that carries great risk for the Kremlin, ahead of an annual Victory Day parade there just next week. It's embarrassing. They have claimed such a breach of security happened. And there will be calls for their battered military to find a way to escalate. Now they have. Ukrainian President Zelensky, on a visit to Finland today, issued a flat denial.
We don't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight on our territory. We are defending our villages and cities. We don't have, enough weapons for this.
The US also not convinced.
I would take anything coming out of the Kremlin with a very large shaker of salt.
But fear of Russian reprisals rising again in Ukraine, where bombings already definitely do happen every day and night. Over a dozen dead this day in a recently liberated Kherson, a railway station shelled and a supermarket mid-morning. Tension mounting here ahead of an expected Ukrainian counter-offensive. So from Friday, there's a 58-hour curfew, nobody coming out of their homes. In Zaporizhia, our night was shaken by sirens and blasts. Here is where they hit. Homes. The first missile landing outside and leaving enough time for families to jump into the bath or shelter their children before the second left this hole. You know, we were in such stress, Ludmila says, that it was only when people asked us if we were okay that we realized we were alive. Like in the Kremlin, nobody killed or injured here either, but lives destroyed and no doubt who was behind it. Nick Payton-Walsh, CNN, Zaporizhia, Ukraine.
Joining me now from Washington, retired US Air Force Colonel and CNN military analyst, Cedric Layton. Good to see you again, Colonel.
Hey, good to be with you, John.
Okay, so the Russians claim, under the cover of darkness, 2 drones flew to the very heart of Moscow for what would be the most serious breach of Russian airspace in 36 years since that kid landed a light plane on Red Square in 1987. But wait, there's more. The drones managed to reach the very heart of the Kremlin before being shot down at the last minute. This smells fishier than the dumpster at Red Lobster. I mean, so what's your take on all of it?
Yeah, that's quite the dumpster at Red Lobster. It's I have to say that it's really an impossible scenario the more you think about it. If the Russian air defense system failed so miserably, it would really be cause for lots of heads to roll. This does very much, when you look at the videos and when you look at exactly what seems to have happened, it is really impossible for this to have been a successful Ukrainian attack. They would have been detected at launch. They would have been detected as they crossed the border. The drones would have been detected several instances on the way to Moscow. There is no way that they would have made it all the way to the Kremlin undetected, and probably would have been shot down, or at least an attempt would have been made way before they hit the Kremlin area.
Okay, so I just want to play the moment when one of the drones appears to be intercepted and then it explodes. So this is just that moment when just before it gets into the Kremlin area, and you can see the explosion, and there it is. So what sort of capability do these drones have for causing any kind of major damage?
Very minimal at best. It's kind of hard to tell from the video how big the drones actually were, but they may have been a lot smaller than I thought initially. Initially, I thought they might be one of the drones that was used to attack the Engels 2 airfield a few months ago in the southern part of Russia. But these seem to be much less capable drones and could very well have been very simple drones with almost no armament on them, if any armament, and certainly very little reconnaissance capability. The other thing to note here, John, is that these drones probably would have had to have been controlled by a ground controller on the way into a target like the Kremlin. And the range of a drone like this, the range of the command and control effort, would have had to exceed 100 miles, and that is not something that most of these drones have the capability of. So I think it seems that on several fronts it would be impossible for these drones to have been launched from Ukraine and have actually been a Ukrainian operation.
And just very quickly, Putin doesn't actually live at the Kremlin, he doesn't sleep there at night, which means this was not much of an assassination attempt.
Not at all. In fact, the Ukrainians are pretty aware of where Putin is, and we know he uses his train. We know he spends time, like you said, away from the Kremlin, especially at night. And this is not a place that he would have been at. If anything, it would have been a warning to him. But I don't even think it was that. I think it was a staged attempt to basically rally the troops, if you will, rally people to the flag. And in this case, I think it's a fairly transparent effort.
What about this theory that Russian insurgents may be behind this attack? Would they have the capability and the opportunity to do something like this?
Potentially. There are several possibilities. Of course, you think of the Wagner Group being at odds with the Kremlin, and that this might have been something that they could have done. There are other groups out there that are interested in, at the very least, making life difficult for Putin, if not potentially even deposing him. It's possible that they could have done it, but I think it's somewhat unlikely that they would have mounted an attack like this, and it's certainly unlikely that the attack would have achieved this kind of a shoot-down sequence.
Okay, Colonel, thank you so much for being with us there. We appreciate your insights and your analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Still ahead, face-to-face for the first time in 13 years. Leaders of Iran and Syria meeting in Damascus, how the Arab world is trying to bring Syria back into the fold, and demand for justice by female wrestlers in India after the head of their sport was accused of sexual harassment. Vedika Sood is there.
You'd expect professional wrestlers to be training inside an academy, but these women have little choice but to train on the road here at the protest site.
And a love so deep we can't measure. Ain't nobody loves me better. Makes me happy, makes me feel this way. Ain't nobody loves me better than you. Ain't nobody. Why do we travel? To discover the unimagined. To see new places, new realms, new worlds. We travel to step into the extraordinary, discovering not just new things to see, but new ways to be. Discover another side of yourself in Arabia.
Last year, Ioniq 5 was awarded World Car of the Year. This year, Ioniq 6. Progress is our law of nature. Progress in space and design. Progress for innovation. Progress for a better world. It's our biggest award, Progress for Humanity.
Inside Africa. Go inside the inventive minds, evolving places, and creative trends of the Africa you need to know now.
In South Africa, pioneers transform the wellness business into an inclusive space for all.
We had similar experience of being in wellness spaces and feeling othered.
Inside Africa on CNN, in association with Zenith Bank.
Damascus is hosting the first state visit by an Iranian leader since the outbreak of civil war in Syria. State media reports Iran's Ibrahim Raisi and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad signed a long-term cooperation agreement on Wednesday. For more than a decade, Syria, under the dictator Bashar al-Assad, has been considered an international pariah because of the brutal crackdown during the civil war on defenseless civilians, the murder of women and children with chlorine bombs, and on it goes. President Raisi's two-day visit comes as the Arab world looks to normalize relations with that regime. CNN's Becky Anderson has more.
An historic visit, 13 years in the making. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi meeting with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. Despite Tehran's ongoing financial and military support for Assad, it is the first state visit of its kind since Syria's brutal civil war began in 2011. Raisi's two-day trip taking place against a backdrop of wider regional efforts to bring Assad back into the fold. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister making a similar trip to Damascus just a few weeks ago.
We are working closely and towards advancing a political solution to the crisis in Syria that preserves its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and makes sure it's part of the Arab fold.
And earlier this week, Jordan hosted a rare meeting between Syria and its Arab neighbours. The tangible outcome of that was Syria agreeing to curb trafficking of the highly addictive amphetamine Captagon. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf are its primary market. The agreement seen by many as a confidence-building exercise. The push for normalisation gaining momentum after a devastating earthquake hit Syria and Turkey in February. Nearly 6,000 people in Syria died, and many Gulf Arab countries rushed to provide humanitarian assistance. Earthquake diplomacy seemingly shaking the Syrian stalemate. Saudi Arabia hopes to invite Syria to an Arab League summit in Riyadh later this month. But some Arab states oppose Syria's return without a political solution to the conflict.
We don't want to impose solutions on the Syrian people. The people need to reach them. There must be a political solution for the Syrian crisis.
And for the millions of Syrian refugees brutalized by Assad's war.
It is a betrayal of the Syrian people. I think for any government to normalize with the Assad regime, to do business with the Assad regime, the person that's responsible for displacing and killing his own people, for the Syrian people themselves, it's a stab in the back. It's a huge betrayal.
Syrian refugees and citizens caught between shifting politics, facing an uncertain future. Becky Anderson, CNN.
The highest court in France has ruled against a referendum over changes to the government's pension system. On Wednesday, the Constitutional Council ruled that raising the retirement age from 62 to 64 doesn't actually violate the French Constitution, ending all immediate legal challenges. The changes have led to massive protests across France for months, sometimes leading to violent clashes with police. Female wrestlers in India are demanding the head of the sport's governing body resign or be removed amid accusations of sexual harassment. After months of investigations going nowhere, the women are now camping out and protesting in the street with growing support from the public. CNN's Vedika Sood has the story.
They're up just after dawn, emerging from tents on a dusty roadside in the heart of New Delhi. Quickly, their makeshift home becomes a training ground. These women are celebrated athletes. They've held this protest vigil day and night for over a week. Their fight could bring a Me Too reckoning for Indian sport. We're Olympians, gold medalists and world champions, wrestler Vinesh Fogart tells me. There's been a grave injustice. We've dedicated our lives to our country, she says. Protest leaders Vinesh Fogart and Sakshi Malik are accusing the most powerful man in their sport of sexually harassing female players. Brij Bhushan Singh, president of the Wrestling Federation of India, strongly denies the allegations. He was asked to step aside earlier this year while the complaint went to a government oversight committee. And while a committee now runs the day-to-day affairs of the federation, Singh officially remains chief. Malik and Fogart are among those who have been demanding a thorough and impartial